For decades, the story of Africa's relationship with the United States followed a predictable script. Washington set the rules, America dictated the terms, and African nations were expected to simply comply. But today, everything has changed. A quiet revolution is reshaping global alliances, and for the first time in modern history, Africa is walking away from the United States. This isn't a symbolic shift. It's financial, strategic, political, and deeply rooted in decades of frustration. America didn't see it coming, and now Washington is scrambling to understand how it lost an entire continent's loyalty almost overnight. The truth is, Africa didn't suddenly wake up and decide to cut off America. This has been building for years. But now, the world is witnessing the consequences. African nations are blocking U.S. products, rejecting American policies, signing strategic deals with new partners, and refusing to act as the geopolitical playground they once were. For the first time, Africa is negotiating as an equal power, and the United States is losing influence at a speed that would have been unthinkable just a decade ago. The shift began quietly, with African leaders publicly defending their right to make sovereign decisions. What started as subtle diplomatic pushes has now turned into bold economic and political actions. Countries like South Africa, Kenya, Ethiopia, Nigeria, Angola, and even smaller nations once dependent on U.S. aid are making decisions that directly challenge Washington's interests. African governments have grown tired of the traditional U.S. approach, an approach built on aid dependency, political pressure, sanctions, and one-sided trade agreements. Instead, the continent is embracing partners who offer respect, infrastructure, manufacturing investments, technology transfer, and equal partner negotiations. But what shocked Washington wasn't simply Africa's new confidence. It was the scale of the strategic shift. In just a few years, African nations have signed multi-billion-dollar infrastructure agreements with China, Russia, Turkey, India, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. These partnerships bypass America entirely. Ports, highways, power stations, manufacturing hubs, military cooperation, and digital infrastructure are being built across the continent, all without U.S. involvement. For the first time, Africa is choosing its partners freely, and America can no longer dictate the direction. This shift hit the United States hardest in trade. Africa began rejecting U.S. agricultural imports, blocking certain American products, and rewriting trade agreements to limit American influence. These decisions cost Washington hundreds of millions of dollars annually, and the losses are growing. The most surprising part for the U.S. government was that African nations did this together. In the past, America relied on division to maintain influence. But now, African countries are coordinating policies, forming continental positions, and using structures like the African Continental Free Trade Area to negotiate as a unified market. This new unity gives Africa unprecedented power, and the United States is struggling to adapt. Washington didn't see this coming because it assumed Africa would always need it. That assumption was outdated. Africa today has the fastest growing population, rapidly expanding cities, exploding digital adoption, and some of the world's richest mineral reserves. The continent is positioning itself as the future center of global manufacturing, green energy production, and technological innovation. America, meanwhile, approached Africa as if it were still the 1990s, a place to influence rather than a continent to partner with. That miscalculation is now costing the U.S. billions in lost opportunities. Another major turning point came from Africa's resource-rich nations. Countries controlling cobalt, copper, lithium, rare earth elements, and oil began shifting deals away from the United States. Nations like the Democratic Republic of Congo, Tanzania, Namibia, and Zambia are rewriting mining laws to demand local processing and end raw material exploitation. These decisions directly affect American companies reliant on Africa's critical minerals, especially for electric vehicles, batteries, electronics, and defense technology. The U.S. government underestimated just how serious Africa was about industrialization. For years, Washington pushed Africa to remain a raw material exporter. But Africa is done with that economic model. The continent is now demanding that minerals be processed locally, that value chains stay in Africa, and that foreign companies invest in manufacturing rather than extraction. Countries rejecting U.S. demands are doing so publicly, confidently, and with the backing of new global partners willing to offer better terms. America didn't expect this level of resistance, and now it's losing access to resources critical for its future industries. The blow intensified when African nations began cutting security ties with the United States. Across the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, governments suspended U.S. military cooperation, expelled Western troops, and terminated long-standing agreements. What shocked Washington wasn't just losing influence, but seeing African nations replace U.S. security partnerships with Russia and China. For decades, America believed its military presence guaranteed influence. But Africa's new leadership believes sovereignty matters more than dependency. And with new partners offering military support without political strings attached, the U.S. is losing its security foothold on the continent. Diplomatically, the shift is even more dramatic. African leaders are rejecting U.S. pressure on global voting blocs, openly criticizing Washington in international forums, and refusing to align with American foreign policy priorities. During key global debates, African countries have chosen neutral or non-U.S. positions, signaling that they will no longer be influenced by threats of aid withdrawal or diplomatic pressure. This represents a major geopolitical loss for Washington, which has relied on African votes in the United Nations for decades. The United States also didn't anticipate Africa's growing technological independence. Nations like Kenya, Rwanda, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and Egypt are building digital infrastructure with partners who offer advanced technology without Western surveillance conditions. American tech companies, once dominant in the continent's digital future, are now being bypassed. Africans are choosing new digital ecosystems, mobile money platforms, satellite networks, and cybersecurity partnerships that limit U.S. influence over data and communications. For America, losing digital dominance in Africa means losing the next generation of global technology influence. Another issue Washington didn't expect was Africa's firm stance against Western narratives. African citizens, especially the youth, are rejecting Western media portrayals of the continent. Social media has empowered Africa's younger generation to shape its own story, one that emphasizes sovereignty, pride, economic ambition, and global partnerships beyond the West. As millions of Africans advocate for self-determination, U.S. soft power continues to decline. The cultural dominance America once enjoyed has faded, replaced by a surge of Pan-African identity. What's even more surprising is that Africa's shift away from the United States is not driven by anti-American sentiment. It's driven by strategic calculations. Africa wants partners who treat it as an equal, offer fair deals, respect its sovereignty, and invest in its future. The U.S. model of conditional aid and political pressure cannot compete with that. And Washington is only now realizing that its approach to Africa is outdated in a world where Africa has options. China builds infrastructure. Russia offers security support. India invests in pharmaceuticals and technology. The Gulf states invest in energy, agriculture, and logistics. Turkey builds factories and airports. Meanwhile, America gives speeches and sanctions and demands political alignment. The moment that truly shocked Washington came when multiple African nations publicly announced that they were pivoting toward non-Western alliances. They made it clear that Africa's future would not be dictated by the United States, Europe, or any single global superpower. Africa is no longer a background player in global politics. It is a rising force, a geopolitical center, a continent with leverage. The U.S. assumed Africa had no power. Now Africa is using that power in ways Washington never predicted. Recent African decisions to block certain American products, challenge U.S. influence in regional conflicts, and diversify diplomatic alliances have forced the U.S. government into reactive panic mode. American officials are suddenly visiting African capitals, offering new partnerships, promising reforms, and attempting to rebuild trust that has eroded for decades. But Africa is no longer desperate for American engagement. The continent has leverage, and leaders are using it to negotiate better deals. For the first time, the United States must compete for Africa's attention. And because Washington didn't see this coming, it is entering the competition late and on Africa's terms. The days of one-sided influence are over. The balance of power has shifted, and Africa now stands as a key player in shaping global economic, political, and technological futures. As Africa continues cutting off America in key areas, trade, resources, military cooperation, diplomacy, and technology, Washington is beginning to understand that the world has entered a new era. Africa is rising, and the United States is no longer the default partner. The future belongs to the nations that respect Africa's sovereignty, treat African countries as equals, and invest in long-term development rather than short-term control. America didn't see this coming because it underestimated Africa, but the continent is now demonstrating its strength in a global landscape where power is shifting east and south. And as Africa continues to assert its independence, one thing is clear: Washington must adapt or continue losing influence, opportunities, and partnerships across one of the world's most strategic and promising regions. Africa has cut off America not out of anger, but out of evolution. The continent has outgrown the old model. It is stepping into a new era defined by confidence, unity, and self-determination. And for the first time in modern history, the world is witnessing Africa choose its own destiny, while the United States watches from the sidelines, wondering how it lost an entire continent without even realizing it was happening. Africa's message is simple: the era of dependence is over, and the era of partnership has begun. Whether America is prepared for that change remains to be seen. But one thing is certain: Africa is no longer waiting.